Thomas Midgley Jr. might be the most impactful inventor you've never heard of, and definitely not for reasons he'd want on a resume. As a respected American engineer and chemist in the early 20th century, Midgley helped develop two groundbreaking innovations of the 20th century. He wasn't some evil mad scientist who set out to doom the planet. In fact, he thought he was doing the world a favor. But decades after his death, scientists and historians began to uncover the real effects of Midgley's work. And it wasn't pretty. Both of his inventions turned out to be environmental nightmares that poisoned the air, damaged public health, and quite literally tore holes in the sky. Midgley has since been called one of history's most dangerous inventors. Environmental historian J.R. McNeill even wrote that Midgley had more adverse impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. So how did one man who didn't build bombs or start wars end up leaving behind one of the most toxic legacies in modern science? Let's talk about the strange, tragic, and oddly fascinating tale of Thomas Midgley Jr. Thomas Midgley Jr. was born in 1889 and graduated from Cornell University in 1911 with a degree in mechanical engineering. By 1916, he landed a spot in the research lab of Charles Kettering at General Motors, where he handled one of the most annoying problems in early automobile design: engine knock. Engine knock was the obnoxious, pinging sound that happened when fuel combusted unevenly under pressure. To drivers, it sounded like the engine was trying to beat itself to death with a tiny hammer. To engineers, it was a riddle wrapped in a headache. But Midgley, ever the curious tinkerer, dove into the problem like a man who thought sleep was optional. Kettering admired him for his intelligent ignorance, a flattering way of saying he didn't know what was impossible. So he just tried everything. And he really did try everything. From melted butter to camphor to aluminum chloride, Midgley tested more than 30,000 fuel additives, most of which had the effect of doing absolutely nothing. He later joked that some of them were about as useful as spitting in the Great Lakes. But finally, he struck chemical gold, tetraethyl lead or TL, an additive that made engine knock vanish like magic. A pinch of this stuff, and engines purred like contented cats instead of clanging like broken shopping carts. By 1921, TEL had proven itself in lab tests. Midgley and his team found that it could eliminate knocking even in high-compression engines. This was the golden ticket. In an era obsessed with speed and horsepower, an additive that made engines stronger and quieter was a miracle. Midgley had done it. Cue the champagne. Cue the parades. Cue the completely justified feeling that nothing could go wrong. General Motors, along with their ever-cautious friends at Standard Oil, wasted no time monetizing the discovery. In February 1923, they rolled out leaded gasoline under the brand name Ethyl, a cute, misleading label that sounded like a friendly neighborhood librarian instead of a toxic compound. Midgley, now a rising star, was promoted to vice president of the Ethyl Gasoline Corporation and hailed as the man who solved one of engineering's toughest challenges. It was hailed as a triumph of human ingenuity. Cars ran better. Engines lasted longer. Stock prices climbed. Everyone was happy, except, of course, the human nervous system. Little did anyone realize that this success story would eventually read like a chemical horror novel. The miracle fuel had a cost, and the bill would come due in a few decades. See, lead was not a mystery substance. Even in the 1920s, scientists already knew it could cause severe neurological and organ damage. It had a reputation older than aspirin and almost as sinister. But Midgley and his team figured the lead released from car exhaust was too diluted to matter, sort of like saying, sure, it's poison, but it's small poison. This would go down as one of the worst scientific assumptions in history. Red flags started flapping immediately. TEL plant workers were falling apart like background characters in a medical drama. In 1924, at the DuPont and Standard Oil plant in New Jersey, 5 employees died, and dozens more ended up in hospitals after suffering tremors, hallucinations, and what doctors politely called lead madness. The press, never one to understate things, called the product loony gas. Midgley himself wasn't immune. After tinkering with Tell long enough to give his nervous system a personal vendetta, he had to take a quiet break to recover from lead poisoning. But then came his infamous stunt. In front of journalists, he poured Tell on his hands and inhaled its vapors like it was lavender oil. He insisted he could do this every day with no consequences, which was bold, considering he'd literally just come back from a lead-induced medical leave. Spoiler, he would not be doing it every day. It gets more surreal. After that press conference, Midgley was forced to take a vacation to cure himself, once again from lead exposure. You really can't make this stuff up. It was the 1920s version of, "I'm totally fine," while quietly calling an ambulance off camera. Still, Midgley and Ethel Corporation didn't back down. Their official line was that the only people in danger were those in the factories. And even then, it was their fault for not being careful enough. With some very creative public relations and industry-funded research, they kept the regulators at bay. A public health expert estimated that New York City would end up with 30 tons of lead on its streets per year, and that barely caused a pause. Several states tried banning leaded gasoline after the 1924 deaths, which lasted about as long as a Prohibition-era speakeasy. By 1926, a federal inquiry influenced by corporate ties announced there was no good reason to ban it. That's how Tell won the public relations battle, with lobbying, marketing, and a healthy dash of denial. And so, leaded gasoline spread across the country and eventually the world. Cars ran better, companies got richer, and nobody gave much thought to the invisible neurotoxin being pumped into the air. Leaded fuel became the backbone of the modern automobile age. But as always, when you dump millions of tons of heavy metal into the environment, it doesn't just disappear. So what happened when all that lead entered the environment and people's bodies? Well, here's when the long-term consequences began to reveal themselves. For a long time, the dark side of Midgley's invention managed to play hide and seek, hiding in the atmosphere, seeping into our bodies. Generations of people were exposed to lead from car exhaust, but because the effects weren't immediate or dramatic, it went largely unnoticed. No one suddenly dropped dead at a gas pump, so the problem was easy to ignore. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that researchers started piecing together what was really happening, and it was horrifying. Decades of burning leaded gasoline didn't just give cars a boost. It caused millions of premature deaths and contributed to a staggering drop in global IQ levels. Lead particles from exhaust didn't just vanish. They settled into the soil, into homes, into lungs, and into childhoods. Kids playing outside were unknowingly marinating in a neurotoxin. High lead exposure was eventually tied to lower intelligence, learning problems, impulsive behavior, and no joke, higher violent crime rates later in life. Turns out, when you poison the population slowly enough, it takes a while before anyone notices. But the damage was colossal. Enter Claire Cameron Patterson, a geochemist who didn't set out to fight big lead. He was just trying to figure out how old the Earth was. But in the 1960s, while measuring lead isotopes in rocks, he kept getting weird results. His samples were all contaminated, even in clean labs. Patterson quickly realized that the problem wasn't with his equipment, it was with the entire planet. The air, the water, the dust, everything was laced with industrial lead. The Earth wasn't just old, it was also poisoned. To fix this, Patterson basically invented the ultra-clean lab, airlocked, filtered, sterilized, probably cleaner than your dentist's dreams. And once he had control over the contamination, he shifted focus. In 1965, he published a now legendary paper with the polite but devastating title, Contaminated and Natural Lead Environments of Man. Translation: we're all marinating in poison, and nobody's doing a darn thing about it. The response from industry was less than supportive. The Ethel Corporation, founded on Midgley's Tell recipe, did everything short of sending him lead-filled hate mail. They tried to discredit his research, pressured agencies to silence him, and even got him kicked off a National Research Council panel, not because he was wrong, but because he was right and inconvenient. But Patterson wasn't the type to go away. He kept taking samples from oceans, glaciers, human bones, and what he found was chilling. Lead levels had skyrocketed in the 20th century. Even Egyptian mummies had cleaner blood than modern Americans. Pediatricians like Herbert Needleman joined the fight, showing how even tiny amounts of lead could impair children's development. It became impossible to deny. Leaded gas was a silent epidemic. By the 1970s, public pressure and undeniable science forced the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to act, though the initial reason was more about saving car engines than saving brains. Lead wrecked catalytic converters, so unleaded gas became the new standard. That gave reformers their opening. Over the next decade, unleaded fuel became the norm, and the phase-out of leaded gasoline accelerated. The results were dramatic. By the late 1990s, lead levels in Americans' blood had dropped by up to 80%. Other countries followed suit, though not all at the same pace. Europe banned leaded fuel in the early 2000s. Developing nations gradually caught up. And finally, in 2021, Algeria became the last country on Earth to ban leaded gasoline. A full century after Midgley's breakthrough. It took nearly 100 years, thousands of studies, and one geochemist with an obsessive lab mop, but the world eventually cleaned up Midgley's first environmental disaster. Along the way, we learned some bitter truths about corporate denial, about the power of scientific persistence, and about just how easy it is to poison a planet when no one's paying attention. And yet, while this chapter was closing, Midgley's other great invention was quietly creating another crisis. In the late 1920s, Thomas Midgley Jr. decided it was time to save the world from exploding refrigerators. No, seriously. Back then, refrigeration was less cool convenience and more chemical hazard waiting to happen. Early fridge systems relied on substances like ammonia, sulfur dioxide, and even ether, chemicals that were either chokingly toxic, flammable enough to torch your house, or both. If your kitchen didn't smell like a science lab, you probably weren't keeping your food cold. Things got so bad that, in 1893, an industrial refrigerator exploded at a fair in Chicago and killed 17 firefighters. And even decades later, there were stories of entire families asphyxiated in their sleep by leaking fridge coils. This wasn't just a design flaw. It was a full-blown public safety crisis hiding inside everyone's icebox. So naturally, the job of fixing this fell to the same guy who already gave the world leaded gasoline. Working with Charles Kettering at General Motors' Frigidaire division, Midgley set out to develop a friendly refrigerant, something that wouldn't poison you, set the curtains on fire, or kill your dog if it leaked. In 1930, he nailed it. He and his team created dichlorodyfluoromethane, a mouthful of a molecule better known as Freon 12. It was odorless, non-flammable, and safe to inhale. 3 qualities not shared by anything else chilling a 1920s turkey dinner. And Midgley, never one to pass up a dramatic reveal, decided to prove Freon's safety with flair. At a meeting of the American Chemical Society, he inhaled a lungful of Freon gas and blew it over a candle flame, snuffing it out. The audience was impressed. He didn't die. The candle did. Freon was a hit. Soon, CFCs like Freon weren't just in refrigerators. They were everywhere. Air conditioners, aerosol sprays, asthma inhalers, foam-blowing agents, you name it. By the mid-20th century, Freon had basically become the HVAC version of sliced bread. And unlike TL, Freon didn't attract critics or controversy. It didn't poison factory workers. It didn't explode. It didn't even stink. Midgley had finally invented something that didn't seem to be killing anybody. This time, the accolades rolled in without the backlash. Midgley scooped up every chemistry award with a name. The Willard Gibbs Medal, the Perkin Medal, the Nichols Medal, and the Priestley Medal. and was even elected president of the American Chemical Society. After all, he'd made refrigeration safe. He'd improved comfort. He'd maybe even saved lives. But unfortunately for humanity, Freon was a bit like a bad houseguest. It seemed harmless at first. Then it overstayed its welcome. Then it started eating holes in the ceiling, up in the atmosphere. A problem was brewing, one that no one, not even Midgley, could have predicted at the time. And unlike engine knock, it wasn't going to be fixed with a clever additive. In the 1970s and 1980s, scientists made a discovery that would have sent Thomas Midgley Jr. straight to the nearest fainting couch, if he hadn't already died in a pulley-related accident. We'll get to that. It turned out that those harmless-seeming CFC gases, the same ones making your fridge cold and your hairspray extra strong, were secretly punching holes in the sky. High up in the stratosphere, these CFC molecules were hanging out like chill house guests until UV light struck them. Then they broke apart and released chlorine atoms that immediately went full supervillain on the ozone layer, Earth's thin atmospheric sunscreen. That ozone layer is what shields us from the sun's ultraviolet radiation, and without it, you get more skin cancer, more cataracts, and a lot of very unhappy plankton. Basically, bad news for everything from humans to ecosystems to that tuna you were planning to eat next Friday. The big moment came in 1974, when chemists Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina published their theory that CFCs were destroying ozone. At first, not many people paid attention, probably because the damage was happening 10 miles above our heads where nobody could see it. But then came the 1985 bombshell. Scientists discovered a giant ozone hole over Antarctica, and suddenly everyone looked up and went, "Wait, that's not supposed to be there." Unlike the slow, silent tragedy of leaded gasoline, the ozone crisis sparked swift global action. Nobody wanted to explain to future generations why we let the sky break. So, in 1987, the world came together for the Montreal Protocol, an international treaty that basically told CFCs to pack their bags and get out. Manufacturers scrambled to develop alternatives, and within a few years, Freon and its chemical cousins were being phased out across the globe. Shockingly and refreshingly, it worked. The Montreal Protocol is still hailed as one of the most successful environmental agreements in history. The ozone layer stopped thinning. In some places, it even began to recover. Full healing will take decades, but we're no longer on track to become a species of sunglasses-wearing lizards hiding from UV death rays. That's a win, but don't get too comfortable. CFCs had a bonus feature. They're also potent greenhouse gases. One molecule of CFC traps as much heat as thousands of CO2 molecules. So, while they were shredding the ozone up top, they were also helping cook the planet below. And here's the kicker. These chemicals are so stable that they'll still be hanging around for up to 140 years. Some of the Freon released in Midgley's time is still up there, doing what it does best, slowly ruining things. So, while the global response was commendable, the damage was already baked in. Midgley's second invention, just like the first, forced humanity to reevaluate how we approach chemistry on a planetary scale. The CFC saga became a cautionary tale, a reminder that just because something works brilliantly in the short term doesn't mean it won't come back in 40 years with a vengeance and a hole the size of Australia. And with that, we've now seen both of Midgley's greatest hits. One put lead in your lungs, the other nearly let the sun fry your DNA. Not exactly the legacy he had in mind. But before we close his storybook, let's take a step back and look at the man himself, and what the world learned from the trail he left behind. Thomas Midgley Jr. didn't live long enough to see the full mess he left behind, which, depending on how you look at it, might have been a mercy. He died in 1944, decades before scientists realized his two biggest inventions had helped poison the planet and punch holes in the sky. His cause of death? Tragically poetic. After contracting polio and becoming partially paralyzed, Midgley designed a clever system of ropes and pulleys to help lift himself out of bed, and one morning, that same invention accidentally strangled him. It was a bizarre, almost cartoonishly dark end. The man who changed the atmosphere itself was brought down by his own bedroom rigging. Age, 55. Death, mechanical irony. At the time, Midgley was still regarded as a brilliant engineer, a man who had made cars run smoother and refrigerators safer. He wasn't some Bond villain rubbing his hands in a lab. He was a respected figure who genuinely believed he'd improve the modern world. And he had, at least on the surface. The problem was, his fixes came with price tags the next generations would be stuck paying for. These days, Midgley's name lives on not in glory, but in cautionary tales. He's the poster child for the law of unintended consequences. He didn't mean to trigger a global health crisis or a planetary climate scare. He just wanted to make engines stop knocking and fridges stop exploding. But when you introduce powerful chemicals into the world without fully understanding their long-term impact, you roll the dice with the future. And Midgley, unfortunately, rolled double disasters. Still, there's a silver lining buried under all that toxic exhaust and thinning ozone. Society eventually caught on. Thanks to tireless researchers like Claire Patterson and ozone crusaders like Roland and Molina, Midgley's mess was brought to light and slowly cleaned up. Leaded gasoline was phased out. CFCs were banned. Scientific norms evolved. Governments got stricter about chemical safety. Environmental awareness was born, largely because of the damage Midgley unintentionally caused. Every ozone-safe sticker and unleaded fuel pump is, in a way, his legacy too. So, how do we remember Thomas Midgley Jr.? Maybe with a strange mix of admiration, pity, and unease. Admiration for his creative brilliance, pity for how his best intentions ended in global fallout, and unease because his story reminds us how easily one clever idea can snowball into catastrophe when we overlook consequences. Is it enough to invent something that works? Or should we also ask what it might break? This question is more urgent than ever in an age of AI, biotech, and rapid innovation. Clearly, Midgley's tale is a gentle plea for wisdom to go along with our curiosity. If you found this story as wild and unsettling as we did, hit that like button to help it reach more people. Subscribe for more in-depth videos on the forgotten corners of science history and the strange ways they still affect our world. And if you've got thoughts or a Midgley-level invention idea you swear won't backfire, drop it in the comments. We're watching carefully. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next time.